The summer sun beat down on the long rows of wooden barracks at Camp Swift, Texas. It was 1943, and the camp was filled with thousands of prisoners of war captured during battles in North Africa. A convoy of trucks rolled through the gates, bringing another group of tired and dirty German soldiers. Dust swirled around their boots as they climbed out, expecting the worst. They had been told that American prison camps were cruel and dangerous. Many of them braced themselves for shouting guards, hunger, and hard labor. The German soldiers marched in line toward the processing area. They passed a tall fence topped with barbed wire. Beyond it, they saw something strange. A group of American guards stood on a wide, flat field. Some wore their uniforms in a casual way, with sleeves rolled up and caps tilted back. They were not holding rifles. Instead, they were holding wooden bats and leather gloves. One soldier threw a small white ball through the air. Another swung a bat and sent it flying. A cheer rose up from the players and a few men sitting on wooden benches nearby. The Germans stopped and stared. This was no drill or training exercise. It was a game, but they did not know what game it was. The ball curved through the air, and the men ran in circles, yelling to each other. To the new prisoners, it looked like complete chaos. The German sergeant at the head of the line frowned. He had been in battles from Tunisia to Sicily, and he had never seen a prison camp like this. In his mind, a prison camp meant harsh order and strict discipline. There was no place for laughter. The column of prisoners moved forward again, but the murmurs spread. Some asked questions under their breath. Others just stared. A few thought the Americans were mocking them. When they reached the main yard, they saw even more signs that this place was different. The barracks were simple but clean. The mess hall smelled of food, real food, not the watery soup they had eaten on the transport ship. There were signs in English and German posted on the walls explaining camp rules. None of it matched what they had been told about American brutality. An American officer greeted them through a translator. He explained that they would be assigned to work details but would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. There would be regular meals, medical care, and time for recreation. The Germans listened with disbelief. Back home, they had heard propaganda about American cruelty. Here, the first thing they saw was a baseball game. That evening, after roll call, the prisoners were allowed into the yard. Some walked close to the fence to watch the game. The field had been set up with wooden bases and chalk lines. The Americans shouted terms they could not understand. Strike! Safe! Home run! At first, the Germans thought the game was only for the guards. Then they saw other prisoners playing too, Italians who had been captured earlier in the war. These men laughed and joked with the guards like old friends. It was unthinkable. One young German soldier asked a guard what the game was called. The guard pointed to himself, mimed swinging a bat, and said, "Baseball." The German tried to repeat the word but stumbled over the strange sound. The guard grinned and handed him an old glove. The leather was soft from years of use. The German slipped it over his hand and looked at it as if it were a piece of alien equipment. When the guard tossed him the ball, he caught it awkwardly, like a man catching a piece of hot coal. The next day, more prisoners gathered at the field. The Americans explained the rules with hand signals and simple German words they had picked up. The first attempts were clumsy. German soldiers threw the ball as if they were throwing grenades. When they swung the bat, they often missed. The Americans laughed, but not cruelly. Soon, everyone was laughing together. The game broke down the wall of silence between captors and captives. For the camp officials, baseball was more than a pastime. It was a way to keep the prisoners busy and reduce trouble. Idle men grew restless and angry. A game gave them a goal, something to focus on besides escape or resistance. It also gave the guards an easy way to watch over large groups without constant tension. If the prisoners were on the field, they were not plotting against the camp. As the weeks passed, the German prisoners began to change. At first, they had been stiff and formal, saluting their officers and speaking only when ordered. Over time, they relaxed. They still followed military discipline, but the sight of Americans and fellow prisoners playing baseball softened their outlook. Some even started cheering for their teams, shouting words in broken English. The sound of laughter mixed with the crack of the bat became a regular part of camp life. Letters went home to Germany describing these scenes. The prisoners wrote carefully, knowing censors would read their words, but the message was clear. They spoke of good food, fair treatment, and games played under the Texas sun. Back in Germany, families were stunned. They had been told that Americans were savages. The truth was different, and it spread through the words of men who had seen it for themselves. At Camp Swift, the daily games continued. Dust rose in the heat as men ran the bases, their boots pounding the dry earth. Guards stood watch from the towers, rifles slung across their shoulders, but even they smiled as they watched the game. The war raged on far away, but inside the fence, the rhythm of the sport gave the camp a strange sense of normalcy. For the German prisoners, the baseball diamond became a symbol of a world they did not understand, a world where war and play could exist side by side. The United States ran its prisoner of war camps according to international law. From the start, American officials made it clear that the Geneva Convention would be followed. This was not just a promise on paper. It shaped the daily life of thousands of captured enemy soldiers during the war. The rules required humane treatment. That meant proper food, medical care, and basic living conditions. In practice, this meant that prisoners ate 3 meals a day, received medical checkups, and had access to recreation. The goal was to prevent unrest, keep order, and show the difference between Allied and Axis policies. Each camp had a simple but efficient layout. At the center stood rows of wooden barracks. These buildings housed the prisoners in groups, often separated by rank or unit. Each barack had bunk beds lined up along the walls, with narrow aisles in between. There were mess halls where large meals were served on a strict schedule. Kitchens were staffed by both guards and selected prisoners who cooked in bulk. Medical buildings sat near the entrance, staffed with trained doctors and nurses. They treated injuries, illnesses, and even dental problems. There were also supply depots, administrative offices, and workshops for repair and maintenance. Around the entire camp ran a tall fence, topped with barbed wire and guarded by towers at each corner. Soldiers with rifles stood watch day and night, making sure no one escaped. Inside the fences, there were open areas for exercise and sports. American officials encouraged prisoners to use these fields during their free time. Baseball became the most visible and popular sport in the camps. It was chosen for several reasons. Baseball was deeply American, familiar to every guard and easy to organize with limited equipment. A few bats, balls, and gloves were all that was needed. The game gave the guards a way to interact with the prisoners outside of routine work. It also served a practical purpose. A busy prisoner was less likely to cause trouble or plan an escape. Physical activity kept the men healthy and tired them out by nightfall. It helped maintain order in a way that constant surveillance could not. In some camps, baseball fields were set up with proper bases and chalk lines. The games were not formal leagues, but they often drew crowds of spectators. The sound of bats hitting balls, men shouting, and laughter carried across the yards. For the Americans, this was normal. Sports had always been a part of military life. Soldiers played to stay fit and to keep their spirits up during long periods of waiting. In wartime, these games also reminded them of home. A baseball field in Texas looked much the same as one back in their hometowns. To the German prisoners, this was strange and confusing. Many of them came from a system where sports had a different role. In Germany, especially under the Nazi regime, sports were used as a form of discipline and propaganda. Athletic activities were tied to military training and political displays. A game was rarely just a game. It was meant to show strength and unity. Competitions were organized with strict rules and formal ceremonies. Participation was often mandatory, and every event carried symbolic meaning. Fun was secondary to the message being delivered. When these prisoners arrived at an American camp, the sight of guards playing baseball for pure enjoyment clashed with everything they knew. At first, they viewed it with suspicion. Some wondered if the games were staged to create an illusion of kindness. Others thought the Americans were trying to mock them. The relaxed attitude of the guards, who laughed and joked during the games, seemed unprofessional by German standards. In their own army, such behavior would have been punished. Over time, the prisoners began to see that the games were genuine. The Americans were not acting for show. Baseball was simply part of their daily life. This realization had a quiet but powerful effect. It gave the prisoners a glimpse into a different culture. They began to understand that not every aspect of the war was about control and punishment. Some German soldiers, especially younger ones, became curious about the rules. They asked questions in broken English or through translators. Guards taught them by demonstrating each move on the field. Slowly, a few prisoners began to play alongside the Americans and even against other prisoners. The camp records show that participation in these games reduced tensions. Fights and discipline problems decreased in areas where organized sports were available. Baseball provided a safe outlet for competition. It gave the men a chance to challenge each other without violence. Guards found it easier to manage prisoners who had something to look forward to each day. The open fields also made surveillance simpler. When most of the camp gathered in one visible area, escapes were harder to plan and easier to detect. The Germans still followed their own routines inside the barracks. They saluted their officers, held morning roll calls, and kept strict order among themselves. But outside, on the baseball diamond, the rules were different. Here, rank meant little. A private could pitch to a captain, and no one cared about titles. The game created a space separate from the war, at least for a few hours. For some, it was their first direct experience with American society beyond combat. The contrast between the two systems could not have been sharper. In German-run camps, prisoners faced constant surveillance, harsh punishments, and rigid structures. Every activity was tied to the war effort. In the American camps, while there were still fences and guards, there was also a sense of humanity. Baseball symbolized this difference. It was a game played for its own sake, with no political message behind it. To the prisoners, this was baffling at first, then strangely compelling. It hinted at a world where play and leisure existed even in the midst of war. The trucks rattled down the dirt road, their engines loud in the hot Texas air. Inside, German prisoners of war sat shoulder to shoulder, silent and tense. Their hands were rough from weeks of fighting and transport. Dust clung to their uniforms, now faded and torn from the desert campaign in North Africa. Most had been captured in Tunisia only weeks earlier. They had been told little about where they were going, only that the war was over for them and that they were now prisoners of the United States. Many expected a hard labor camp, poor food, and constant punishment. The convoy passed through the main gate of Camp Swift. A tall wire fence ran in every direction, with guard towers at each corner. Soldiers in clean khaki uniforms stood watch with rifles ready. From a distance, it looked like any military post, strict and orderly. The prisoners braced for shouting and commands. Instead, they heard something they did not expect: laughter and cheering. The sound came from beyond a row of barracks. As the trucks slowed, the prisoners craned their necks to see. A wide open field stretched out near the center of the camp. A group of American guards and other men ran across the field in what appeared to be complete disorder. Some held long wooden clubs. Others wore odd leather mitts on one hand. A white ball flew through the air. One man swung his club and hit the ball with a loud crack. The men on the field shouted and sprinted in different directions. A crowd on the sidelines cheered loudly, clapping and stomping the benches they sat on. The German prisoners looked on in confusion. To them, it resembled a drill, but there were no commands, no salutes, no formation. The players laughed even when they failed. Some wore undershirts instead of full uniforms. Their movements seemed chaotic, without clear purpose. The senior German sergeant barked at his men to stay in line, but even he could not keep his eyes from wandering toward the field. The trucks came to a stop and the prisoners climbed down. They were immediately counted and lined up under the watchful eyes of armed guards. An American officer gave instructions through a translator, speaking calmly but firmly. The prisoners were told the camp rules and marched toward their assigned barracks. As they passed the field again, the game continued. It was unlike anything they had ever seen in a military setting. Whispers spread through the ranks once they reached the barracks. Some prisoners thought the game was staged to trick them. They suspected propaganda designed to make the camp seem friendly. Others wondered if it was a test, a way to see how the new arrivals would react. A few believed it was part of psychological warfare meant to break their discipline. The uncertainty unsettled them more than open hostility would have. That evening, after they had been processed and given food, a guard approached their barracks and motioned for a group to follow him. He led them to the edge of the field where another game was about to start. Through gestures and a few words of broken German, he invited them to watch. The prisoners stood stiffly behind the fence, unsure of how to respond. The guard tossed one of them a baseball. The man caught it awkwardly and looked down at it as if it were a strange piece of equipment. As the game began, the confusion only deepened. The Americans shouted words they did not understand. Safe, out, strike. The players ran in circles, chased the ball, and cheered each other on. It made no sense to the prisoners, who were used to strict drills and carefully timed marches. To them, sports were tools of military training or displays of state power. A game with no clear purpose seemed childish and dangerous. Some German officers watched with growing concern. They worried that this display would weaken their soldiers' sense of discipline. A few gave quiet orders for their men to stand apart and remain silent. They feared that if their troops began to enjoy these games, they might forget their duty and loyalty. Maintaining order among their own men became their top priority. The Americans, on the other hand, understood the value of what was happening. Baseball served a tactical purpose. It kept the prisoners occupied and visible. Men who were running bases or cheering on teammates were not plotting escapes or fighting among themselves. The field was open and easy to monitor. Guards on the towers could watch every movement without tension. The game itself acted as a kind of control, more effective than constant shouting or punishment. In the days that followed, some of the younger prisoners began to show curiosity. They edged closer to the field and tried to mimic the actions of the players. A guard handed out a few old gloves and showed them how to use them. At first, the Germans moved stiffly and clumsily. They threw the ball as if it were a grenade, lobbing it with exaggerated care. When they swung the bat, they often missed completely. The Americans laughed, but it was not cruel laughter. The mood stayed light, and slowly the Germans began to laugh as well. This created a new dynamic in the camp. The games became a meeting point where guards and prisoners interacted on equal terms. It was still clear who held authority. Armed sentries remained at the edges of the field, and the rules of the camp did not change. But on the diamond, rank mattered less. Even a private could pitch to an officer. For a short time, the lines between captor and captive blurred, replaced by the simple focus of playing. The senior German officers continued to watch closely. Some disapproved of their men joining the games, believing it would erode discipline. Others accepted it quietly, seeing that the camp ran more smoothly when the men had an outlet for their energy. The Americans relied on this subtle balance. Baseball kept the prisoners manageable without constant displays of force. It was a simple game, but in the context of the war, it was a tactical tool as important as any weapon. The first days in the camp were a blur of noise, movement, and disbelief. The German prisoners walked the dusty paths between the barracks, staring at the fences and the towers. What surprised them most were not the guards or the rifles, but the food and the calm order of the place. Meals were regular and filling. Thick bread, meat, and vegetables were served on trays. Coffee was available every morning. Some prisoners sat in silence as they ate, still expecting the rations to run thin or the rules to turn harsh. Others whispered to one another, comparing the meals here to what they knew of Allied prisoners back in Germany, where shortages were constant and treatment was often brutal. For many, this was the first sign that the world outside their own army was different from what they had been told. The shock deepened each afternoon when they heard the sharp crack of a bat striking a ball and the cheers that followed. Baseball remained a mystery to them, but it was impossible to ignore. The sight of armed men putting down their rifles to play a game felt unreal. It seemed wrong to laugh so openly in the middle of a war. At first, the prisoners stood at a distance, hands clasped behind their backs, watching silently through the fence. A few of the younger ones leaned forward, trying to make sense of the movements. They asked questions in German, which went unanswered until a guard who knew a few words of their language explained what he could. The game had positions and rules, but they were unlike anything the Germans knew. There was no single goal like scoring in soccer, no straightforward combat like fencing or wrestling. It was a contest of skill and timing that seemed slow at moments, then burst into sudden action. The more they watched, the more their curiosity grew. In Germany, sport had been serious, tied to strength and military readiness. Here, the game seemed relaxed. Men joked and clapped each other on the back. Failure brought laughter instead of punishment. It was clear that the game mattered to the Americans, but not in a way the prisoners could fully understand. One day, an American guard walked over to the group of watching prisoners with a worn leather glove and a baseball. Without words, he tossed the ball to a German soldier standing at the edge of the group. The man caught it clumsily, his fingers closing too late. The guard laughed, not with malice, but in genuine amusement. Then he pointed to his own hand, showing how to slip the glove on and how to grip the ball. Another toss followed, and this time the catch was cleaner. The small exchange drew the attention of others. Soon, a half-circle of prisoners stood around the guard, each taking a turn to catch and throw. When one of them was invited to pitch, he stepped forward nervously. In his mind, throwing meant grenades, not games. He gripped the ball tight, raised his arm high over his head, and hurled it with a sharp downward motion, as if he were in combat. The pitch sailed wildly past the batter and skidded into the dirt. There was a moment of silence, then laughter erupted from both sides of the fence. Even the German soldier smiled at his mistake. The guard retrieved the ball and mimed the proper motion, his hand moving smoothly forward instead of overhand like a weapon. The soldier tried again, this time with better aim. A cheer rose up from the Americans, and a few Germans joined in, surprised at their own reaction. Moments like that began to change the atmosphere in the camp. The guards still held authority, and the prisoners remained under strict rules, but on the field, there was room for connection. Some guards looked forward to the games as much as the prisoners did. For them, baseball was a piece of home brought into the camp. It reminded them of summer evenings and familiar fields far from the war. The sound of the bat striking the ball cut through the tension of guard duty. As the weeks passed, teams were formed from among the prisoners. They played against each other while the Americans watched, offering advice and sometimes joining in. Language barriers faded as hand signals and simple words replaced long explanations. Ball, strike, and safe became part of the shared vocabulary. For the German prisoners, the games were both thrilling and unsettling. They could not help comparing their treatment to what they knew of Allied prisoners in German camps. Some felt shame as they wrote letters home describing the clean barracks, the medical care, and the games under the Texas sun. They imagined Allied prisoners suffering in cold cells and wondered how they themselves had ended up in a place where sport and laughter coexisted with barbed wire. There were still men who refused to take part. Some officers kept their distance, standing with folded arms and stern expressions. They worried that their soldiers would lose their discipline and forget their duty. But even they could not entirely stop the shift in mood. At night, as the camp quieted, laughter and conversation drifted from the barracks where the players gathered to talk about the day's game. The guards noticed the change too. When the prisoners played baseball, fights and arguments dropped. Work details ran more smoothly. Men who had been sullen and defiant began to cooperate, at least in small ways. Baseball gave them something to focus on beyond escape plans or resentment. It also gave the guards a way to manage the camp without constant force. On a warm evening, under a sky streaked with orange light, a game reached its final inning. A German pitcher, once stiff and awkward, now threw with surprising skill. The crowd of prisoners cheered him loudly, while American guards clapped from the sidelines. For a brief moment, the war seemed far away. The fence was still there, the towers still stood, but the shared rhythm of the game created a space where enemies could see each other as men rather than symbols of opposing nations. The baseball games were more than simple recreation. They carried weight far beyond the dusty fields where they were played. Every letter written by a prisoner described life in the camp. The Germans had been told by their own government that Americans were cruel, that captured soldiers would face hunger, torture, and humiliation. These stories collapsed under the words the prisoners sent home. They wrote about regular meals, clean barracks, and strange American customs like playing games during wartime. Censors read every letter before it left the camp, cutting out details that might reveal troop movements or security matters. Even so, enough information slipped through to create a picture of life inside the fence. Families back in Germany were shocked to hear that their sons and brothers were treated fairly. They compared these accounts to what they knew of Allied prisoners held in German camps, where food shortages, forced labor, and harsh punishment were common. The contrast spread quietly through towns and villages, weakening the Nazi narrative that portrayed the Americans as ruthless enemies. Some letters described baseball directly. A few prisoners wrote about how they had been given gloves and shown how to play. They described the rules in simple terms, comparing the game to familiar sports like soccer or handball. The image of captured soldiers playing games under the watch of their captors was strange, almost unbelievable. These stories became powerful tools of unintended propaganda. They showed that the Americans not only defeated their enemies on the battlefield but also treated them with dignity afterward. For the U.S. Army, this was not just about good optics. There were practical reasons for allowing and even encouraging these games. A camp full of restless prisoners was a dangerous place. Fights could break out easily. Escape attempts required constant vigilance. Every hour a guard spent breaking up disputes or chasing escapees was an hour taken away from other duties. Baseball helped solve this problem without violence. When prisoners played on the field, they were visible to guards stationed in the towers. The open space allowed for easy observation. At the same time, the game itself acted as a safety valve. Competition on the diamond replaced conflict in the barracks. A man who spent his energy running bases and swinging a bat was less likely to cause trouble later. The games gave structure to the day. They broke up the long hours between meals and work details, keeping men focused on something other than resentment or escape. Commanders noticed the difference. Camps with organized sports had fewer incidents of violence. Escape attempts dropped because prisoners felt less desperate. When men felt they were treated with a basic level of fairness, they were less likely to risk their lives running for freedom across open countryside. The numbers told the story. Each game played saved time, resources, and manpower. A handful of bats and balls did the work of additional guards and stricter discipline. The system was efficient. Fewer guards were needed to maintain order because the prisoners managed themselves in subtle ways. Leadership among the prisoners shifted from officers who preached defiance to those who organized teams and taught rules. This internal structure benefited the Americans. By encouraging harmless competition, they gave the prisoners a stake in maintaining peace. Even prisoners who refused to play often gathered to watch. The field became a natural gathering point where the population could be monitored without constant confrontation. Baseball also built quiet connections between the two sides. Guards and prisoners shared moments of humor and challenge that did not exist in other settings. A guard might correct a throwing stance or explain a rule with hand gestures, and a prisoner might respond with a nod or a hesitant smile. These small exchanges created trust. They were not acts of friendship, but they softened the edges of hostility. Some prisoners began to admire the Americans in ways they did not expect. They saw that strength could be shown through restraint, that a guard could enforce rules without cruelty. This respect was subtle, almost hidden, but it grew with each game. When these men eventually returned to Germany, they carried those impressions with them. The experience influenced how they spoke of the United States in the years that followed. For the Americans, this was a form of soft power, though they did not use that term. The games planted seeds that would matter long after the war ended. A man who once viewed his enemy as nothing more than a target now saw him as a person with his own culture and traditions. The reverse was also true. Germans who had been taught to hate Americans began to see them as individuals rather than faceless enemies. This shift had practical consequences even before the war was over. Interrogations became easier when prisoners trusted their captors. Work details ran smoothly when there was mutual understanding. Letters home carried a tone of reluctant respect rather than hatred. These effects spread far beyond the fences of Camp Swift and other camps like it. The war was fought with tanks, planes, and rifles, but it was also fought with ideas. Baseball, in its own quiet way, became part of that struggle. A game on a field in Texas could influence morale thousands of miles away. Each time a German prisoner described the scene to his family, another crack appeared in the wall of propaganda that the Nazi regime had built. The Americans understood that words could travel faster than soldiers. They used that knowledge to their advantage, not through speeches or leaflets, but through the simple act of letting men play. As the games continued, the camps became models of stability. Fewer guards were injured, fewer resources were spent on security, and fewer prisoners died. The U.S. Army could focus on the larger war effort while knowing that its captives were contained and under control. Baseball was not just a pastime. It was a tool of strategy, as vital in its way as any supply line or field order. It showed that even in a time of destruction, small acts could shape the outcome of a global conflict. When the war ended, the camps began to empty. Prisoners boarded trains and ships, heading back to a Germany that no longer resembled the country they had left. Cities were in ruins, families were scattered, and the government they had served no longer existed. Many of the men carried more than their few belongings. They carried memories of life behind American fences, memories that surprised those who heard them. The stories spread slowly at first. A returning soldier would sit at a family table and describe clean barracks, regular meals, and open fields where baseball games were played under a hot sun. At first, his listeners might shake their heads, unwilling to believe such things. They had heard only of Allied bombings and battlefield losses. The idea that American guards had allowed their prisoners to play games seemed impossible. Yet more men returned with similar stories, and the truth became harder to dismiss. For many former prisoners, the baseball field was the most vivid memory. They recalled the feel of the worn leather glove, the sound of the bat striking the ball, and the way laughter echoed across the yard. Some spoke of the first time they tried to play, how they threw the ball as if it were a weapon, and how the guards patiently showed them a new motion. These memories stood out because they were so different from everything they had known in war. In the middle of a global conflict, they had been treated as human beings rather than enemies to be crushed. A few of these men carried their interest in baseball home with them. In small towns and cities, makeshift fields appeared in empty lots or on the edges of parks. The game was never as popular as soccer, but it took root among a small group of enthusiasts. They taught the rules to friends and children, passing along the same lessons they had once learned from American guards. For them, baseball was not just a sport. It was a reminder of a strange and unexpected chapter of their lives, a time when play existed alongside barbed wire and guard towers. The impact went beyond personal memory. In many German communities, these stories challenged old beliefs. During the war, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as violent and corrupt, incapable of honor. Letters and first-hand accounts from returning prisoners told a different story. They described guards who enforced rules firmly but fairly. They spoke of shared jokes, mutual respect, and moments when the boundaries between captor and captive blurred. These accounts did not erase the anger or grief of the war, but they planted seeds of understanding. Over time, these stories became part of the broader picture of how the United States treated prisoners compared to its enemies. Historians studied the camps and found that while conditions were far from perfect, they were far better than what many Allied prisoners endured in Axis hands. The baseball games became a symbol of this difference. They represented more than leisure. They showed a philosophy of war that included restraint and humanity. The symbolism reached beyond Germany. In the United States, veterans who had served as guards remembered the games with a sense of pride. They spoke of how the fields gave shape to their days and how they connected, even briefly, with the men they were tasked to contain. Some recalled teaching German prisoners to throw a ball or explaining the rules through hand gestures. These memories were carried home and passed down to families, becoming part of the personal histories of the war. As decades passed, researchers and journalists uncovered more of these accounts. Photographs surfaced showing prisoners lined up in baseball uniforms, grinning as if they were part of a local league rather than captives of a foreign power. These images contrasted sharply with the destruction shown elsewhere in wartime records. They offered a glimpse of normal life carved out of abnormal circumstances. In Germany, former prisoners sometimes gathered for reunions. They spoke of their time in the camps, comparing experiences from different parts of the United States. Baseball often came up in these conversations. One man might describe his first hit, another his role as a catcher, and a third how he had once been cheered by both prisoners and guards for a well-played game. These recollections were not romanticized. The men remembered the fences and the watchtowers too, but they also remembered the moments when those barriers felt less absolute. The legacy of these games extended into diplomacy. In the years after the war, Germany and the United States moved from enemies to allies. Cultural exchange programs grew, and sports often played a role in building these new ties. Baseball, though never a dominant sport in Germany, became a symbol of American culture. It represented ideas of freedom, leisure, and fair play. For those who had once been prisoners, it carried personal meaning as well. Some former prisoners wrote memoirs describing their experiences. In these books, the baseball diamond appeared again and again. It was never just a field. It was a stage where human nature revealed itself, where men who had fought each other found common ground. Readers in both countries came to see these accounts as part of a larger story. They showed that even in the midst of war, individuals could act with decency. Over time, the story of baseball in the camps found its way into museums and documentaries. Visitors saw artifacts like gloves, bats, and faded photographs. These simple objects told complex stories. They spoke of a time when the United States chose to treat its captives according to principles rather than vengeance. They also showed how those choices echoed long after the last game was played. The memory of those fields remained sharp for the men who had been there. They could recall the smell of the dust, the sound of the ball connecting with wood, and the mix of voices shouting in English and German. For them, the games were not a symbol or a lesson. They were a lived experience, one that shaped how they saw their former enemies and, in many cases, how they saw themselves. Even decades later, when they gathered with their families, the stories would surface. A simple game of baseball had become part of their lives, woven into the history of a war that had reshaped the world.